So what I'm going to try to do is talk for 40 minutes and then have 10-minute Q&A. So if questions occur to you in the course of the talk, feel free to jot them down and then hand them to me right after. We'll go straight into the Q&A for 10 minutes or so, then take a break, and then do it again. There'll be a Q&A session after each talk, okay? And the Q&A, the Q&A will not be recorded or disseminated, but it'll probably be recorded but not disseminated. So 40 minutes and 10 minutes and then break, and then the same thing again. So this first talk is going to be a little, I'm going to talk fairly quickly, and it's going to be doctrinally and theologically dense, all right? The remaining talks today are going to be more practical, but we need to get a solid, concrete foundation first. So, what is marriage? On a subject like this, solid definitions are very important, just as false definitions are very threatening. But as we define, we have to take care that we do not define as good little abstractionists. Biblical knowing, especially concerning marriage, is not a rarefied exercise. It is practical and embodied. How you define is going to affect how you live this afternoon and this evening. In Genesis, it says, Genesis 2, starting at verse 18, "And the Lord God said, it is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helpmeet for him." Our first talk is your help from the Lord. This is the helper from the Lord is your wife. "And out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every fowl of the air, and brought them unto Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof. And Adam gave names to all cattle, and to fowl of the air, and to every beast of the field. For Adam there was not found an helpmeet for him. And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall on Adam, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs, and closed up the flesh instead thereof. And the rib, which the Lord God had taken from the man, made he a woman, and brought her unto the man. And Adam said, This is now bone of my bones, and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed." I think it's striking that out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field, every fowl of the air. And he did the same thing with Adam. The only living creature who was not formed out of the ground was the woman. All right, that's striking and I think indicative of other things to come. In the course of his creation of the world, God repeatedly calls his creation good. But when he comes to the solitary male, he says it is not good, verse 18. All right, good, not good. It's not good that man should be alone. God looks at the solitary male and says to himself that he is clearly not finished here. Immediately after this, God brought all the beasts and birds to Adam to see what he would call them. And Adam had the privilege of naming the animals, which is verse 19. But in the process of naming all the animals, Adam found no helper suitable for him there. Verse 20, meaning that Adam clearly shared God's sentiment that it was not good for him to be alone. All right, so God and Adam agree. And so the Lord God threw Adam into a deep sleep, and the word there indicates like a coma-like state, like a typology of death. Threw Adam into a deep sleep, removed a rib from his side, and closed the flesh back up, 21. God took that rib, fashioned it into a woman, and brought the woman to the man, verse 22. And then we find the first recorded words of man. Bone of my bones, verse 23, and they are a poem concerning his wife. So the first recorded human words are poetry. Then follows an apparent decree from Adam concerning the marriages of all his descendants. A man will leave his father and mother, cleave to his wife, and they will be one flesh. Verse 24. And the man and his wife were both naked and unashamed. Verse 25. So in contrast to the earlier situation, this setup was good. So when Adam was by himself in paradise with all the animals there and everything was wonderful, that setup was not good. This setup was good. The creation was filled with goodness. When God created the light, it was good, 1:4. When he created the earth and the sea, it was good, 1:10. When he fashioned the reproducing herbs and trees, it was good, 1:12 and 2:9. He made the sun and moon, and it was good, 1:18. He filled the oceans and sky with teeming fish and birds, 1:21. When he made all the reproducing animals after their kind, it was good, 1:25. The gold in the earth was good, 2:12. Viewing all of it, God said that all of it was very good, 1:31. But we have to notice the strong element of separation in all of this goodness. Light divided from the dark was good, right? The separation is not an evil. The separation is a good. Light divided from the dark was good, 1:4. God divided the earth from the water, and it was good, 1:9. The herbs and the trees dividing after their kind, that was good, 1:12. God made the sun and moon to divide the light from the darkness, and that was good, 1:18. God made the fish and birds to divide after their kind, and it was good, 1:21. He divided the animals after their kind also, 1:25. But Adam was unitary, solitary, undivided, and alone. So God put him into a deep sleep and divided him into two pieces. God then took the second piece, made it into a woman, and brought her back to him in order to heal the division. All right, so Adam was unified, not good. He was divided. Then God brings the woman back to Adam to heal the division. God made one into two in order to change those two back into one in a different way. All right, so Adam was already one. So why take the roundabout route? He was already one. Well, God wanted a richer, deeper, more textured one. So he divided Adam into two, fashioned the rib into a woman, brought her back so that the two might become one. And that means division in order to attain to a higher unity. Division in order to attain to a higher unity. In a Trinitarian world, unity divided and division unified are good. Unity divided and division unified are good. The two alternatives to Trinitarian unity of this kind, the two alternatives to Trinitarian unity in diversity and diversity in unity are not pleasant to consider. The alternatives are unity, period, and two, fragmentation, period. You can have just one great big monolithic thing, unity, period, or you can have anarchy. You can have diversity all over the floor, fragmentation. This is a poor choice indeed, and it is the only choice that unbelieving thought can present to us. Either we have the monolithic unity of Parmenides or the fractured whirl of Heraclitus. It's either one big monistic thing or it's an atomistic fractured thing. We either have the false unity of modernity or the equally hollow diversity of postmodernity. The only way out of this impasse is Christ, who brings us to the Father and reveals the Trinity to us. Now, Paul develops this theme in the New Testament. So I'm not just tricking people into coming to a marriage conference and then shoehorning theology into it. Marriage, biblically speaking, is a theological construct. And one of the reasons why we are in such disarray is because we have abandoned theology. Because we abandoned theology first, we lost marriage. And we have to return, we have to scrape away everything and get down to the foundation to rebuild this thing. So Paul develops this theme in the New Testament. For the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. Neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. Nevertheless, neither is the man without the woman, neither the woman without the man in the Lord. For as the woman is of the man, even so is the man also by the woman, but all things of God. That's 1 Corinthians 11, 8 through 12. So, just as the first woman was divided from the first man, so every man since that time has first been divided from his mother. Before the first woman could be united sexually with the first man, she had to be divided from him. Before any man since that time can be united sexually with a woman, he has to be divided from a woman. Okay? Now this is, again, not something I thought up to, here's a weird thing to think about. This is Paul's argument in 1 Corinthians 11. Every man was divided from a woman in order to be united to a woman, and the first woman was divided from a man in order to be united to a man. But all things are from God. This whole thing is intentional. God This is a work of artisanry. In short, marriage as difference and unity is woven into the nature of all creation. Marriage as difference and unity is woven into the nature of all creation and is consistent with it. Man has no authority to defy it. Man can name what God has done. Adam had the authority to name. He named Eve, for example. Adam has the authority to name what God has done, but man cannot get God to name what man has done or is trying to do in his own name. Legislatures can decree that men can now start marrying men, and they can also, while they're at it, decree that water will start flowing uphill. They can decree that triangles will henceforth have 4 sides. It's impotent. It falls to the ground. The whole thing is going to be a helicopter crash. There is no way that it can be anything but a helicopter crash. So, what then is marriage? Marriage is a form of death in separation and resurrection in union. Okay? This is what marriage is. It's a form of death in separation and resurrection in union. When God created the world, he immediately set about fashioning the world by means of division. He separated man into male and female. So he divides light from darkness, sun and moon, earth and the dry land and the ocean, and so on. He separates. And he separates man into male and female and pronounces all of it very good. But he divided for the sake of richer union. The division is for the sake of a richer union and not for the sake of the division itself. God does not divide so that things could remain divided. God divides so that it could be knit together more closely. But what is the principle of this kind of union? Okay, what is the unifying thing? The answer is covenant, covenantal partaking. All right, covenantal partaking. The bond that ties division and union together is a covenant bond. Marriage is based on covenantal realities. 1 Corinthians 11:3, but I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. The nature of the union goes all the way up. Right? The way God and Christ are united, and the way Christ and the man are united, and the way the man and the woman are united. It's all the same kind of thing. Now, we need to note that in Paul's language, head does not mean bossy pants. It doesn't. Now, head is authoritative. I'm going to get to that later. A head has true authority, but he's not it's not a brittle machismo kind of thing. But it is true authority. Headship is a covenantal category, and it's an essential aspect of covenantal living. An essential aspect of covenantal living is covenant partaking or fellowship. The Greek word is koinonia. Koinonia means fellowship. But as much, when modern Christians think of fellowship, they think of coffee and donuts and chatting. Koinonia is a much stronger word. It's a partaking. All right? There's a close union and partaking. There's no such thing as a boss over here commanding someone else over there. That's not how authority works. Covenant headship bridges the division and accomplishes union. So, to take the biological illustration, my head has never once boasted against my elbow. They've never gotten into a fight because the authority that's involved is an authority that is entailed in the union. Right? It's the most natural thing in the world for my mind to tell my hand to do this, and there's no quarrel. There's no quarrel between them. It's an organic union that is the embodiment of that authority. Those men who browbeat their wives are setting everything upside down. Okay, and those wives who browbeat their husbands are setting everything upside down twice, in 2 ways. Authority, and this is the takeaway that I'd like you to get. Authority is the principle of union, not the principle of separation. Authority is the principle of union, not the principle of separation. Separation happens. You were born separated from your mother, that you might be joined to your wife, and the authority comes with the joining, not with the separating. Authority, biblically understood, is what brings the man and the woman together. This means that every husband partakes of the headship of Christ. Christ partakes of the headship of God the Father. The woman partakes of the headship of her husband. And all of this happens in the same covenantal way. In other words, marriage is defined by partaking. Marriage is defined by partaking. As we realize this, we can see that the statement about headship in 1 Corinthians 11:3 is actually the hinge of a long argument that began in the previous chapter. The Israelites partook. This partaking thing is not an incidental thing in the New Testament. The Israelites partook of Christ in the wilderness, 1 Corinthians 10:1-5. And they partook of idols in the rebellion, right? The covenantal partaking, 1 Corinthians 10:6-11. The Corinthian Christians partook of Christ in the Lord's Supper, 1 Corinthians 10:16-17. The Old Testament priests partook of the sacrifices of the altar, chapter 10, verse 18. Gentile pagans partook of the table of devils, chapter 10, 19-22. None of this happens metaphysically, but rather covenantally. That's 10, 23-33. The grace involved should not be understood by us as some kind of magic. Paul says that he is a partaker by grace, 10:30. And then he breaks off his discussion of the Lord's Supper and resumes it in 11:17. But it's critical to note that this section on marriage in the middle of this partaking in chapter 10, the Israelites in the wilderness and the idolatry of the Old Testament, all of that, and this section on marriage, and then he resumes his discussion of the Lord's Supper in 11:17, he's not changing the subject. It's crucial that in his discussion of men and women and role relationships in 11:3-16, he is not changing the subject for a brief moment. It's not that Paul got distracted by a squirrel and ran off after it. He is not changing the subject at all. This whole thing is about partaking. Okay, this whole thing is about partaking. Just as Christ partakes of the Father covenantally, 11:3, so men partake of Christ, and so women partake of their husbands. This is obviously not the only kind of partaking possible. For example, both men and women together partake of Christ, as in Galatians 3:28. But all partaking is some kind of covenantal partaking. This means that you are not at odds with your wife. You are not roommates. You are one. Okay, you're not roommates. You're not, it's not friends with benefits legally and morally. It is, you are something else organically, covenantally. You partake of one another. Now, we've seen in all these examples that covenant partaking is built into the very structure of the world. The world is a covenantal place. And when you deny the reality of covenants and then try to live as though there are no covenants, it's like trying to live in the world while ignoring the existence of gravity. It just doesn't work. You're going to encounter difficulties. This means the world is not divided between those who partake and those who do not partake. Rather, it is divided between those who partake righteously and those who partake unrighteously. Okay, this is an inescapable concept. It's not whether you partake, it's which way you're going to partake. Are you going to partake of your wife biblically and obediently, or are you going to partake of your wife disobediently? All right, but the partaking aspect of it is a given. The partaking is inescapable. We cannot go anywhere to opt out of partaking. There's no opt-out. For example, a man can partake of his wife, Ephesians 5:31, or of a prostitute, 1 Corinthians 6:16. But in either case, he is partaking. In either case, he's weaving himself into some sort of covenantal thing. Put another way, Paul had used the example of partaking of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Okay, it's going to be one or the other. The world only has two tables. There are only two tables in it. There is no neutral table. There is no table you can go to in the cafeteria of the world where you're not saying anything one way or the other. is either the table of the Lord or the table of demons. And this also, incidentally, just while I'm here, this also shows you that we're not in a world where God interrupts the proceedings in order to do a miracle in the Lord's Supper. What's happening in the Lord's Supper is it's a true organic covenantal union. We really do partake of Christ in the Lord's Supper. But if we went and ate at an idol's temple, we're partaking of demons. And God's not doing a miracle there that enables you to partake of demons. What he did is he structured the world, he created the world, he embedded covenantal realities into the very nature of all things. Right? So you have to say, if I'm indulging in porn, what are the covenantal ramifications? Because there are covenantal ramifications. If a man is unfaithful to his wife, what are the covenantal ramifications? Because there are some. If a man is pursuing his wife faithfully, what are the covenantal ramifications? Because there are covenantal ramifications to everything. And if he, let's say someone says, well, like the disciples once said when Jesus talked to them about divorce, and they said, well, it's better not to get married at all. If he rejects women entirely, he's partaking of the doctrine of demons, 1 Timothy 4:1-3. You can't not partake, right? If you say, I'm going to chase all the women, that's partaking unrighteously. If you say, I'm going to partake of one woman faithfully, that's partaking obediently. If you say, who needs women? I'm checking out. I'm not going to do any of this. Then you're partaking in another direction. Every direction you go, you're partaking. So, with all this said, we have to ask, what are the preconditions for covenant partaking in a marriage for blessing? All right, so the partaking is inescapable. You want the partaking to be something that blesses both you and your wife. And the first is that you must have an explicit covenant surrounding a sexual relationship. That's what marriage is. Marriage is defined, if you have someone, if you just have a sexual relationship and no covenant, it's fornication, not marriage. If you have a covenant, if you, for some reason, you make a covenant, but there's no consummation, that's not a marriage either, okay? In order to have a true marriage, you have to have a covenant made and you have to have consummation. Now, not everyone who is sexually united is married, and not everyone who has exchanged vows with another is married. The covenant exists when the two elements are there together, when there are covenant vows surrounding a covenant union. They have to be covenant vows and a covenant union. The second precondition, so you have to have a marriage, and the second precondition is the grace of God. Remember that Paul said that he partakes by grace, chapter 10, verse 30. And the grace of God manifests its presence in our lives by means of the fruit of the Spirit. The third precondition is clear awareness of the assigned roles that God has given to husbands and wives respectively, particularly in worship, but also particularly in the home. So, responsibilities of husbands is what I'm going to get into in the second talk. What are those assigned tasks? What are husbands responsible to do? If the grace of God is present, he is blessing your relationship, and you might find yourself in better shape than someone else who knows a whole lot more than you do, has read all the books or has maybe written some of the books, but the grace of God is not resting there. There's something wrong. If the grace of God is not there for blessing, then it's not blessed. And if you are 19 and your wife is 19 and you go into marriage without a clue in your heads, right? But God's blessing is on you, God's grace is on you, it's a good thing. Okay, God's grace is what makes this go. In God's pattern, in God's way, glory increases as it descends. Glory increases as it descends. In Christ, the one who descended the furthest, all the glory of the Godhead is revealed. So Christ stooped the lowest, and therefore his name is above every name. Right? That glory is resident in the one who stoops the lowest. Man bears the image of Christ, and woman bears the image and glory of the man. Conversely, this glory is revealed through submission. All right, Christ submitted to his Father. Man submits to Christ. The woman submits to the man. Christ submitted to the glory of the Father. Men submit to the glory of Christ. Women submit to the glory of a husband who is doing this. Now, of course, once we come over to this side of the creator-creature divide, we have to deal with husbands and wives who were born into a race that is in revolt against this cascading glory. Right? Glory increases as it descends, and a central part of the reason why our world is in the shape it's in is because we've rejected that approach to glory. We're in rebellion against it, and so we Christians are part of the resistance that God has carved out from the human race to get back to the way it was before. God is rebuilding the human race in Christ, and we want to get back to this other way of thinking that we rebelled against in our first parents. Now remember that the revolt against God's way does not eliminate the partaking, but it does eliminate the blessing of having partaken. Further, it incurs the judgment of a jealous God who hates it when husbands and wives tempt him. So we live in a man-centered age, and consequently, we frequently miss the entire point of God's warnings. We think that the judgment on our marital sin is the mere judgment of an unhappy marriage, and that death, at least, would end all that. But many husbands and wives really need to consider their ways and live. How many husbands will come under the judgment of Christ for how they neglected these things during the course of their marriage? Did they live as though Christ were their head? How many wives will have to answer for how they stumbled their husbands and their families? Did they live as though their husbands were the head? The chief end of marriage, is the same as the chief end of man, to glorify God and enjoy him forever. The chief end of marriage is not to have your needs met. Okay? The chief end of marriage is not to be the husband of a happy wife. The chief end of marriage is not to be the wife of a happy husband. The chief end of marriage is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. The chief end of marriage is not to get your husband to, quote unquote, finally see. It's not to get your wife to be more responsive. The chief end of marriage is to glorify God on his terms and to do this forever. So we have seen that the creation of man, male and female, is not unrelated to God's pronouncement that the whole creation was very good. But the same thing is true of the new creation in Christ. In the new creation, the relation of husbands and wives plays an important part in the worship of the church. And conversely, the right worship of God plays an important role in our marriages. So the health of our marriages is going to translate and is going to contribute to the health of the church, and the health of the church is going to feed the health of the marriages. This connection helps us understand Paul's discussion of worship in relation to his discussion of partaking and headship. For man indeed ought not to cover his head, for as much as he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of the man. John Newton wrote a wonderful hymn that alludes to this passage, and it's glorious things of thee are spoken. And he alludes to this passage, 1 Corinthians 11, and one other passage in Isaiah, in a wonderful way, tying the two of them together in what is almost certainly an important allusion by the Apostle Paul. The hymn, glorious things of thee are spoken, and the relevant lines are for a glory and a covering, showing that the Lord is near. For a glory and a covering, showing that the Lord is near. Those words, glory and covering, coming together, are quite striking. The prophet Isaiah, speaking of the times of the new covenant, refers to the Shekinah glory. So the Shekinah glory is a type of the kind of glory that's going to be evidenced in the new covenant. So Isaiah, talking about the new covenant, refers to the Shekinah glory, the glory that used to accompany Israel in the wilderness, in this way. This is what Isaiah says, Isaiah 4:5. And the Lord will create upon every dwelling place of Mount Zion and upon her assemblies a cloud and smoke by day. That's the Shekinah glory, the cloud and the pillar of fire and that accompanied Israel in the wilderness, and the shining of a flaming fire by night. For upon all the glory shall be a covering, or the glory shall be a defense. And the NKJV translates it, for over all the glory there will be a covering. Over all the glory there will be a covering. This is what Paul is referring to in 1 Corinthians 11. A godly wife is to her husband what the Shekinah glory was to the tabernacle. And if it's not like that, then somebody's doing something wrong, and it's not her. Let's narrow this down. Now, this is how it all ties in with our foundational theology of marriage and what we believe marriage actually is. The Bible teaches that a woman is the glory of her husband. The woman is the glory of her husband. She is his crown. That's Proverbs 12:4. A virtuous woman is a crown to her husband. Okay? And a man does not walk down the street kicking his diadem in front of him in hopes of making himself look better or more important. Okay? If a king despises his crown, what kind of idiot king would be in a competition with his crown? Like, well, I don't like the fact that the crown is higher than I am. I'm 6'1", the crown is 6'3". So, if a man, well, let's pursue it a little further. However we interpret the passage, we should be careful to make the glory of the woman central to it. So some people have jumped on this the wrong way. They've said, well, it says that man is the image and glory of God, and woman is the glory of man, as though woman is the little put-put glory. Man is the glory of God, and woman is the glory of the man. She gets the participant ribbon, and he gets to be the glory of God. But that's not the point at all. The point is not to hide women or to make them look dowdy or put them in the back of the church as though we are embarrassed of them. Women are the glory of their husbands, and that glory should be as obvious as a pillar of fire by night. It needs to be as obvious as a circlet of diamonds around his forehead. Now, her demeanor, her carriage, her demeanor in 1 Corinthians 11, how she behaves, how she does her hair, the woman is the crown of her husband, and the crown goes on the head in a position of honor. She honors him, and in so doing, she consequently receives greater honor. This is a Hebrew way of thinking, and it's a way of expressing a superlative. Okay? The superlative is when we say that the woman is the glory of the man, we're not giving her the participant ribbon. It's a superlative. He's the glory, and she's the glory of the glory. He is the glory of God, and she is it's like the Holy of Holies. He's holy, and she's the Holy of Holies. He's the glory, and she's the glory of the glory. She's the crown. And it's not an accident that I said earlier that every creature is fashioned from the dust of the ground, Adam included. Every living creature is formed from the dust of the ground except for the woman. She is the last created being in all of the creation week. Right? So you get to the end of the cathedral and you're putting the capstone. You're doing the final finishing touches at the top of the cathedral. That's the woman. So when this has been sort of inverted and turned into something other, and it's quite astonishing to me how we sometimes take express statements of the Bible and just ignore them. And well, our tradition doesn't do that, or we don't teach that, or that's not what we believe. The Bible says that, and Peter says in 1 Peter 3 that men should live with their wives with understanding, and they should treat them with honor. And it's the famous verse where it says that women are the weaker vessel, and so we immediately invert what the passage says, because we have certain, men particularly do this, men have certain particular assumptions about what they do with weakness. What's weaker, a china teacup or a 9-pound sledge? Right? Well, a teacup is weaker, but it's better. it's weaker, and you can buy this for $10, and this is a priceless thing. When Peter says, husbands, treat your wives with understanding, live with your wives with knowledge, and he says, honoring them, instead of reacting like an 8th grade boy would react, teasing the girls in his class. See, Peter says you're weaker, neener. He's demonstrating what his reading comprehension is like, right? Honoring them. Now, what do? Well, in business, when you discover a weakness in your competitor's business plan, what do? You exploit it. You do everything you can to exploit that weakness. If you're a football coach and you discover 3 plays into the game that the other team's left tackle is a weenie, what do? You run your plays there all night long. That young boy is going to have the longest night of his life, and he's going to be in counseling for years afterwards. Because men know what to do with what they perceive as weakness. But Peter says, you're misunderstanding the whole setup. Right? You live with your wives with understanding, honoring them. Honoring them. Why? Well, because she's the glory of the glory. She's your crown. She is the one who is given by God to you. Pro tip, she's given to you by God to make you look good. All right? Tough challenge, but God. You propose to her and she's praying, oh Lord, such a steep hill. Yeah. She is your glory, and your job is to give her the wherewithal to function as your glory. And that means you have to understand that she is partaking of you, and you are partaking of her. And if you partake of one another as male and female, as husband and wife, in the right way, then certain things are going to start to happen naturally. All right, because this is how God made the world. If you rebel against how God made the world, and you're trying to figure it all out yourself, you're going to wing it. I know what to do with weakness. I need to be the tough guy, or that kind of thing. You're just going to make a hash of it. So, how would biblical obedience, if a man truly honored his wife and honored her for what God created her to be, and because she's commanded, and Nancy talked to the ladies about, she's commanded to honor you the way you were created to be. How would biblical obedience, if we were to do this, be slandered and caricatured? If we were actually behaving in this way, actually living this way, the caricature would never be that those Christian men browbeat their wives. A much more plausible slander would be that Christian men glorify their wives to the point of encouraging vanity. Right, that's going to be the more plausible accusation. Now, we don't want to fall into that sin either. There's always a ditch on both sides of the road. But I think we should be living in such a way as to provoke that slander and not the other one. Okay, you want to stay on the road. You don't want to drive into either ditch. You don't want to browbeat your wives, and you don't want to flatter them, because we live in a world that currently is flattering every feminine perspective, no matter how crazy it is. If it comes from a woman, you've got to bow down. And then the end result of that is we don't even know what a woman is anymore, right? So that's that ditch. You don't want to do that. You don't want to do the other thing. But if we are taunted with some sort of slander, I would much prefer the slander that we treat our wives with an exorbitant amount of honor. The right kind of honor, biblical honor, not some false knockoff medieval chivalric thing, but biblical honor. All right, so this talk is on the responsibilities of a husband. And we're going to begin. I want to begin by talking about the privilege of marital duty. These are duties, these are responsibilities, but duties need not be onerous. They need not be burdensome. If you have the right attitude toward God and His law and God and His gospel, it's all grace. When God assigns a duty to you, it is a gift. He's giving you the clarity of an assignment. You know what you're for. You know what you're supposed to do. So, in thinking about marriage, we tend to think that spontaneous actions are genuine, while others performed from a sense of duty are stifled, artificial, and contrived. We especially think this way if we are considering questions, quote unquote, of the heart. Doing one's duty is thought to be restrictive to true love. You see this, let's say a tender-hearted grandma comes over and they're visiting with her daughter and 2-year-old son, and she gives him a little gift when she's departing, and the mystery of lawlessness descends upon the 2-year-old. And because mom says, say thank you to grandma, and I'm not gonna say thank you to grandma. And so mom, being a good mom, says, can you wait here by the door for a minute? I'm gonna take little Billy back to the back room and give him some admonitions. And grandma, being a tender-hearted grandma, says something like, oh, I don't want him to be disciplined. I don't want him to be spanked because he didn't say thank you to me. I want him to thank him because he just means it. And mom says, well, give me a couple of minutes and he's going to mean it. In other words, there are things that we consider spontaneous that were drilled into us when we were little. We were taught the duty, and the duty, when we first learned it, might have been cumbersome or awkward, but now it's natural. And that's the thing that we're after. You as you're fulfilling your marital duty as a husband, you want to have it become a habit, have it become habitual, have it become natural. So here's the discipline of, if you watch a concert pianist playing some glorious Bach piece on the piano, on the one hand, you look at that and say, that seems natural in the sense that God gave us fingers and this is what man was made for, right? It's natural in that sense. But it's unnatural in that it took 20 years to train the fingers to go that way, right? But once you've learned it, once you've gone through that training, it sets you free to do a bunch of stuff that you couldn't do otherwise. That's how we should think of our marital duties and responsibilities as husbands. The Bible defines love as a wholehearted keeping of God's commandments, a wholehearted keeping of God's commandments. The greatest act of love was certainly the death of Christ for his people, and that act of love was not offered on an emotional high, right? Jesus, the night he was arrested, he spent his time in the Garden of Gethsemane praying to get out of it. And yet, that was the greatest act of love ever offered up in the history of mankind. The whole time he was praying to get out of it, he was surrendered in principle to the will of God, yet not my will, but your will be done. He was never rebellious against God's will, but there was a tussle. He was despondent even to the point of death, he told his disciples. That means that there are times when you are going to go do your duty with regard to something in your marriage or anywhere else for that matter, and you might not feel like it. That doesn't keep it from being a duty rendered to God from your heart. So, it was a bitter grief for Christ to drink the cup of God's wrath, but that grief does not take away from his love for us. Rather, it adds to his love for us. The fact that when you get up in the middle of the night to go offer some service to your family, some kid got sick in the hall and you clean it up, right? Do you feel like it? Is this something, oh boy? Well, no. But the fact that you don't have that spontaneous urge to, I need to set the alarm to go out and look for some vomit to clean up. That wasn't on your list. But the fact that you have to mortify your responses and do the thing anyway adds to the love. It doesn't take away from the love. Now, there's a way of complaining and murmuring and moaning about it all the way through that takes away, right? There's a way of not feeling like it that robs you of the glory of doing your duty, but there's another way that adds to it. When we come to our duties gladly, it helps us to discipline our emotions. When we come to our duties with the knowledge that God has framed them for us and has assigned all marital duties appropriately, we can rejoice in his goodness. So the result is not a negation of spontaneity, but rather a disciplining of it, so that when you're an experienced parent, let's say, when something happens, you just move into the drill. This is what we do. All right, we're parents, or this is what we do. We're family. All right, so with that said, that's a preface to the nature of duties. I want to talk about certain specific duties that husbands have. In both the Hebrew of the Old Testament and the Greek of the New Testament, the word for husband is usually just the word for a man, with the context showing that it is the husband who is in mind. However, another fairly common word in Hebrew for husband is, interestingly, Baal, B-A-A-L, which means Lord, means master or Lord. And in Greek, for the New Testament, there are at least two instances of this sort of usage for husbands: kurios, which means Lord, and hupandros, which means man above. Hupandros means man above, and kurios means Lord. The English word husband is a wonderful word which encompasses all of these biblical descriptions of a married man. There are the connotations of lordship, but it's a lordship involving a great deal of care, sacrifice, and tenderness. So husbandry means taking care of something, sacrificially taking care of something, overseeing something. That's what husbandry is. And a husband is someone who is exercising husbandry in his marriage and in his family. So a husband has to always remember that as a husband, he is a living picture of the Lord Jesus. This remembrance is his first duty in marriage. This is the primal duty in marriage. Every husband and every father is talking about God or talking about Christ all the time. You don't have the option of shutting up about Christ. You're talking about him all the time. If you are kind to your wife, you're talking about Christ. If you are unkind to your wife, you're talking about Christ. You're lying, but you're talking about Christ. Because of the position you're in, you are representing Christ to your family. You're representing Christ to your bride. Christ is the bridegroom. His church is the bride. In your relationship with your wife, you are modeling or living out what you think Christ is like. You're doing something similar with God the Father and your children. When your children grow to adulthood and they come to pray the Lord's Prayer in church service, does the words "Our Father" stick in their throat? Because Father brings up all sorts of connotations of someone who never paid any attention to them. Or Father brings up the connotations of someone who lost his temper frequently. Now this is, God, we're a world full of sinners, and God still tells us that Christ is the way to the Father. So we're supposed to work through the bad connotations of Father in order to worship God the Father. But, and this is very important, we shouldn't be making our problem worse for ourselves. What we should be doing is modeling what God the Father is like to our kids, modeling what Christ is like to our wives. So this remembrance, remembering that you are enacting the role of Christ to your wife, is your first duty in marriage. In Ephesians 5, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for. So that's the first duty. Since as a husband, a man is speaking constantly about the Lord's relationship to his people, he ought to seek to speak truthfully as well. He's got to speak, so he should speak the truth. The way the man treats his wife will determine whether he is speaking truth about Christ or not. But he does not have the option of remaining silent. He is speaking all the time. If you're giving your wife the cold shoulder, you're lying. If you are speaking unkindly, you are lying. If you're speaking thoughtfully, truthfully, you're telling the truth. This is because the Lord is a husband, and all husbands are therefore representations of him. Now, you're filling out the connotations of what your wife thinks of when she thinks of husband, right? And because then when she's reading her Bible and she reads, the Lord is your husband, what comes to mind? Oh, no? Oh, no, you don't want that. And this goes back to the question that was asked in the break about an abusive background. All right, so some people come into marriage like a dog that's been beat too much, and every noise is cringe, like a cringe reaction. And if you're in that situation, you need to be going the extra mile to overcome those connotations. Now, because his relationship is speaking of Christ and the church all the time, he must learn to imitate Christ in character as well. And this points to a man's second duty. The Bible is very clear that the Lord is a husband to his people. For your Maker is your husband. The Lord of hosts is his name. Isaiah 54:5. Also see Jeremiah 31:32, Revelation 21:2, Ephesians 5:23. For your Maker is your husband. The Lord of hosts is his name. As a man seeks to imitate the Lord in his duties, he must be a husbandman to his wife. He's got to be a husbandman. And this means taking care. Now, C.S. Lewis, I think it's in the Four Loves, says women tend to define love as taking trouble for others. Men tend to define love as not giving trouble to others. Now, the wife's definition is way closer to agape love than the man's definition. So you're having some friends over for dinner. Who spent the day cleaning the house? Who spent the day preparing the meal? Who is concerned about whether they're going to have drinks when they come in the door? Who wants to make sure that someone takes their coats? Well, generally, the wife is taking all kinds of trouble to have the company over. And as they're debriefing after the evening, the husband is feeling proud of himself because he didn't start any fights with anybody. What do you mean? I was a perfect host. I was thoughtful. I answered their questions. I didn't give trouble to others. Well, husbands need to learn how. This is like so many things that having to do with life between the sexes. There has to be a meeting in the middle. Men need to learn how to take trouble for others. In this respect, they have to become more like their wives. Wives need to learn to take less trouble for everybody else. Again, C.S. Lewis said, she was the kind of woman who lived for others. You could tell the others by their hunted expression. Sometimes not every gift is appreciated, and sometimes sitting there like a slug is not appreciated, and so you want to meet in the middle. A husband must be a husbandman to his wife, which means he has to take thoughtful care. This means he must nourish and cherish her in the same way that he cares for his own body. This is Ephesians 5:29. Nourish and cherish. All right, this is a demeanor activity that's assigned to husbands. Nourish and cherish her in the same way that you care for your own body. And the word for nourish there is ektrepho, which means to feed, to bring up to maturity. The word cherish is thalpo, and literally it means to keep warm. To keep warm, to cherish with tender love. So a husband is assigned the duty of nourishing his wife and keeping her warm. Nourish your wife, feed her, grow her up, and keep her warm, cherish her with tender love. So a man who does not take particular and tender care of his wife, and who then expects her to be fruitful and lovely, is not being a true husband at all. He is a dolt. The Greek word for this is meathead. So where does a man must love his wife sacrificially. Ephesians 5:25, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. And he must not expect anything but weeds unless he tends the garden with extraordinary care. So the husband is given two patterns or two templates to imitate. One, husbands, love your wives this way. The first one is the way Christ loved the church. And the second one is as you love your own body. The way you take care of your own body, that's the golden rule applied to marriage. Love your wife the way you take care of your own body, and love your wife the way Christ loves the church. Now, one word of, and both of those are very high bars, right? Because you take good care of yourself, and you and Christ laid down his life, paid the ultimate price for his bride. Now, you want to take, with the second one, with the golden rule applied to marriage, you want to take care here. George Bernard Shaw, who was an unbeliever, but he had something shrewd to say here. Do not do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Their tastes may not be the same. Okay? When the Lord gives the golden rule is mutatis mutandis. Everything else being equal. If your wife has a roaring headache, you treat her the way you would like to be treated if you had a roaring headache, and those things are comparable. It does not mean that you get your wife a shotgun for Christmas because you wanted one. The golden rule is not a good rule for shopping. Honey, I got you a bass fishing boat. True story here. Years ago, one of our friends told us a story that back in their early days of marriage, the husband did get his wife a shotgun for Christmas. He was kind of a clueless husband, got his wife a shotgun for Christmas because that was his idea of a good gift. And his wife was telling Nancy about this years after the fact. She said it was all right, it's okay, because she said the next year I got him a string of pearls for Christmas. And she said, and they were very nice pearls. So, the golden rule, love your wives as you love your own body, and love your wives as Christ loved the church. This is related to a third duty, and this is going to be an odd one, or might strike you as odd initially. A third duty, which is that of jealousy. Jealousy. This perhaps jars our modern sensibilities. We're accustomed to view jealousy as a personal problem rather than as a virtue to encourage and cultivate. This opinion or reaction is simply more evidence of how far we've fallen from biblical convictions concerning marriage. A husband must be jealous and protective. A husband must be jealous and protective. Paul uses this image of a good husband to exhort the Corinthian Christians to faithfulness. In 2 Corinthians 11:2, he says, "For I'm jealous for you with a godly jealousy. For I have betrothed you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ." So this kind of jealousy is a good and godly and righteous jealousy. In following the Lord, Christian men must remember that God's name is jealous. The Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Exodus 34:14. Now, it is quite true that jealousy can be wrong and destructive whenever it's driven by any kind of bitterness or resentment or malice. But the same could be said for many other attitudes, right? Any number of other attitudes, if mixed with sin, become sinful. Right? Love mixed with sin becomes sinful. Jealousy mixed with sin becomes sinful. Jealousy does not need to be mixed with sin, and I think it needs to be present in your life. And under numerous circumstances, it's a sin not to be jealous, right? Let's say, I'll just draw an extreme example. If you're at let's say you go to some non-believing event, right? political event or something where it's a drinks and people are circulating around and whatnot. If in that event some random guy starts hitting on your wife and you act like you don't care, what that means is you don't care. Right? And what you've just done is going to be deeply unsettling to a godly wife. You should care. You have to care. What are you doing? What are you doing? Now, of course, you don't take a swing at him, right? You don't respond in an ungodly way, but there's a certain kind of possessiveness, a godly possessiveness that imparts security to your wife. You're with me, right? I came with you. You're coming with me. You're with me. You're my wife. And now that can be communicated in a grabby way, like a self-centered way, but it can also be communicated in a godly way. God, whose name is jealous, the way Paul communicated. All right, so those are some of the big duties, but there are also some mundane duties involved with being a godly husband. For example, a husband must supply his wife with the food she needs. A husband must supply his wife with the food she needs. We can see this in a law given to ancient Israel, where a man was not permitted to defraud his first wife of certain marital rights through his polygamy. Now, this is in Exodus 21, 10 and 11. Now, polygamy has always been, just a quick statement about this, polygamy has always been subcreational. Right? It's always, so when God created Adam, he created Adam and Eve and not Adam and Eve and Sally and Susie. He created Adam and a wife, not Adam and a harem. So the creation pattern is clear, one man, one woman. We see in the New Testament that Christ has one bride, and we see in the New Testament that Christian elders are required to be one woman man. All right, so that's the norm. Monogamy is the norm. But when the scriptures are given in the Old Covenant era, polygamy, just as it's a reality in many parts of the world today, and it will probably be a reality in our country at some point if things don't turn around. You have to deal with, well, what do you do when you go preach the gospel in an African village and the chief is converted and his 3 wives are converted and you're faced with a now what? Right. Well, now what? They stay married. He keeps 3 wives, but he doesn't become an elder in the church because he's got to be a one-woman man in order to be an elder and so on. So I'm using a law in the Old Testament. Polygamy was, God was riding the brake. He was doing certain things that would discourage it or that would bound it or keep it from going completely off the rails. So I'm not endorsing polygamy here, but I want to argue from a passage about polygamy. Exodus 21, 10 and 11. If he takes another wife, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, and her marriage rights. And if he does not do these 3 for her, then she shall go out free without paying money. So this was, if a man in ancient Israel wanted to take a second wife, he had to take on a second wife. He couldn't just exile the first wife to a corner of the house and have a functional in-house divorce. He had to stay married to the first wife. And then the descriptions of what he owes to her gives us some idea of the baseline of what a husband owes his wife. He shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marriage rights, conjugal rights. So he must keep her cupboards full, he must keep her closet full, and he must keep her arms full. Right? So that's the requirement. Now, reasoning from this, I would say that's a basic baseline duty for husbands. We see here that one of the duties of a husband is to see to it that his wife has the money she needs for groceries and not to begrudge it. Okay? Now, you don't want to say, here's the credit card, go off on a frivolous shopping trip to expensive boutiques. That's not what it's saying. But it's saying she has a right to look to you to keep the cupboards full, the money she needs for groceries. Put another way, A man may not shake himself free of certain basic marital obligations simply through taking another woman. It follows that the provision of food is one of those obligations. In the New Testament, we see that a man who does not take care of his extended family is worse than an unbeliever. 1 Timothy 5:8. What then can we say of a man who does not take care of his immediate family by neglecting his wife? Neglecting your wife in this way is a form of apostasy. Neglect of a man's wife in this fashion is the equivalent of apostasy. It's a denial of Christ who feeds his bride. In the same way, the Bible requires that a husband must supply his wife with the clothing that she needs. Okay? Yeah, and you're muttering to yourself, yes, but no human being needs that many shoes. Pro tip, yes, they do. And women think about clothing differently than men do, and that's one of their glories. That's one of the good things. You can get by. I got a lot of these blue shirts. I'll take 28. But women don't think that way, and we're glad they don't. Then the next thing, a husband must also meet his wife's sexual needs. 1 Corinthians 7:3-4, Exodus 21:10. In this regard, his body belongs to her. Paul uses very strong language with regard to this. He says that this is an area where the wife exercises authority over her husband. Exousia is the Greek word. She exercises authority over her husband. 1 Corinthians 7:3-4, let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does, and likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. As one aspect of this, a husband must not deny his wife an opportunity to bear children. A husband must not deny his wife an opportunity to bear children. And Judah said to Onan, go into your brother's wife. This is the Levirate marriage. The brother had died. Go into your brother's wife and marry her and raise up an heir to your brother. But Onan knew that the heir would not be his. And it came to pass when he went into his brother's wife that he emitted on the ground, lest he should give an heir to his brother. And the Lord struck Onan down, not because of a particular sexual act and not because of birth control, all right, but rather because of the fraud involved. All right, it was a fraudulent transaction. I'm going to enjoy you sexually, but I'm not going to give you the opportunity to bear a child in the name of your deceased husband. It's necessary to remember that sexual activity is not seen in the Bible as merely a recreational indoor sport. It is not just recreation. It is recreation, but it's not just recreation. It is recreative. Okay, it's not just recreation, it's recreative. The duty to provide wives with an opportunity for having children may seem bizarre to the modern mind. But this simply shows us how little modern husbands nourish and cherish their wives. And, unfortunately, many women have been propagandized to the point where they don't think they want that either. But there's something deep within men and deep within women that rejoices in the fruitfulness of family. The Bible's very plain about another duty of husbands as well. A husband must be content with his wife. A husband must be content with his wife. Proverbs 5:15-23, Matthew 5:28. He is prohibited from coveting the wife of another man. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. Exodus 20:17. Not only must he not long after the wife of somebody else, he is positively commanded to be content with the wife he has. All right? So, Proverbs 5:15-19 says, drink water from your own cistern and running water from your own well. Should your fountains be dispersed abroad, streams of water in the streets, let them be only your own and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice with the wife of your youth. As a loving deer and a graceful doe, let her breasts satisfy you at all times and always be enraptured with her love. All right, so the Bible has an express commandment to husbands to be, you see this one woman here that you married? Be content with her. It's not just the duty of staying physically faithful to her, but having a wandering eye and wishing you were elsewhere. It is staying put because you want to stay put, staying put because you're devoted, staying put because you're content with what God has given to you. So, specifically, the man is commanded here to be satisfied with his wife's breasts and to be enraptured with her love. To compare a woman with others, whether silently or aloud, whether with words or actions, is always odious. It's always destructive. And the more comparisons are made, the less contentment is possible. A husband must be content in all areas. Consequently, comparisons must be avoided in all areas, whether involving beauty, cooking, intelligence, imagined sexual responsiveness, whatever. For men, it is particularly important to be content in the sexual area. This is much easier if the husband is doing what he ought to be doing in all the other areas of responsibility that I've already touched on. In Hebrews 13:4, it's interesting, you should read on to the 5th verse right after. In Hebrews 13:4, it says, the marriage bed is honored above all, and the bed undefiled. Right? But whoremongers and adulterers, God will judge. So that's the marriage is honored of all, and the marriage bed is honored by Christians. And then the next verse is, be content with what you have. Be content with what you have. So contentment, one of the great challenges and lies of pornography is that it is the stir up of discontent. It just churns up discontent. Why can't she be like that? Why not? You're just basically being catechized in discontent. And that catechism is going to be very destructive. So, another duty, and this is going to, I'll conclude with this one and then we can take questions. So if you have questions, be writing them down. Another duty involves the ongoing responsibility of a husband to review and approve commitments made by his wife. To review and approve commitments, time commitments, money commitments, helping your friend out commitments, to review and approve commitments made by his wife. In Numbers 30, verses 13 through 15, it says, every vow and every binding oath to afflict her soul, her husband may confirm it, or her husband may make it void. Now, if her husband makes no response whatever to her from day to day, then he confirms all her vows or all her agreements that bind her. He confirms them because he made no response to her on the day that he heard them. But if he does make them void after he's heard them, then he shall bear her guilt. Now, what this is talking about is a pledged offering to the tabernacle. Okay, so if a wife has pledged a certain amount, let's say they're raising money for the parking lot, and somebody comes through the tents of Israel, and the wife says, we can give 10 shekels to that. Husband comes home from work. If he hears about her pledge to the tabernacle, he has the option of overriding that pledge when he hears it. If he doesn't override it specifically, then he ratifies it. So this is another way of saying not to decide is to decide. A man can't say, well, I didn't say anything one way or the other. She just sort of ran ahead. Well, the day you hear of it, then you should, if you don't like it, and it's not just a personal dislike, but you think, oh, that's not good. We don't have 10 shekels, or, there's some problem with it. Then you need to speak up and speak up on the spot. Here's how this principle would, you come home and find out that your wife offered to babysit the neighbor kids, 3 of them, for the next 6 months. Okay, because the neighboring mom had a sob story and it's so hard and no difficulty and I'm trying to get work and my husband's out of work and he's so busy with video games in the basement and so your wife volunteered to watch the kids and for 6 months until we get on our feet. When the husband hears that, he should say, honey, how about no? We're not doing that. And that nobody's breaking their word. Right? The husband has the authority. Now, if he just simmers about it for 3 days and the whole thing blows up later, and then he says, I didn't like it the first moment I heard about it, what that's called is abdication. He's not taking responsibility. So we should recognize that when a husband says nothing, he is approving and leading by default. He's approving and leading by default. Whether he speaks or is silent, a man cannot cease being the head of the home. In other words, for husbands, sinning by omission is much easier than it is for a wife. Okay? Sins of omission are things that you should have done, should have said, should have intervened, and did not. Now, he can do it badly or well, but he cannot really escape from the responsibility that God has placed on him. So he has to be some sort of wall of protection for his wife against, if she made a commitment too quickly. But when these things happen, you want to do it in such a way, you don't want to steamroller right over your wife and say, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard, why'd you do that? It needs to be done thoughtfully and considerately. Honey, I don't think that that's good for you or me or for the neighbor kids or our kids. I'm going to say no on this. And if you do it right, if you communicate it right, you're going to have a situation where she comes back to you 2 weeks later and says, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Right? That's the kind of response you want because you've been a fence. You've been a wall of protection. You've been a firewall.